Welcome to the Ramalinga Swami Center and our colloquium series on equity and social determinants of health. We are thrilled today to welcome Professor Madhulika Banerjee from the University of Delhi and the New Institute, Hamburg, Germany. Professor Madhulika Banerjee teaches political science at the Department of Political Science in the University of Delhi since 2004. Prior to that, she taught at undergraduate colleges since 1985. So she has an almost 40-year career that she's bringing to the table today. Her doctoral thesis was on power, culture, medicine, Ayurvedic pharmaceuticals in India. And it was significantly revised and expanded into a book titled Power, Knowledge and Medicine, Ayurvedic Pharmaceuticals at Home and in the World. She has written extensively on Ayurveda since then, both in peer-reviewed journals and the popular media. In this time, she was also on fellowships at the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine in London, the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, and in international academic collaborative projects with colleagues from France and Brazil. Her current focus is on how understanding the engagement of traditional knowledge with modernity offers a fresh framework of praxis for responses to the climate crisis. Her most recent publication that laid the ground for this was in Politics of Knowledge and Development, an Analytical Frame. She is currently working on a book on this theme and has spent a year on a fellowship at the New Institute in Hamburg. In fact, she just returned to Delhi a couple of weeks ago. When we spoke, I requested Professor Madhulika to bring this sort of thinking and this new sort of framework to bear upon what we know about knowledge systems in health and medicine, and she very happily agreed to do so, and we're thrilled to learn from you today. Thank you, Professor Banerjee. I request all attendees, if you have any questions, to please put them in the Q&A box that's available at the bottom of your screen, and it will be picked up for moderation in a discussion towards the end of our session. Thank you so much. Over to you, Professor Banerjee.
Thank you so much, Abha, and to the center, Ramalinga Swami Center. I'm really, thank you so much for this invitation. I'm thrilled to be here myself. It's really a privilege, to address an audience that works in the broad common areas as mine, but those that I don't normally get to engage with. I was just sharing with the colleagues that it's an unusual and therefore exciting opportunity for me. What I'm going to do is actually read from a written text, because these are arguments that are preliminary and in the process of being refined. And so I didn't want to take any chances with the way in which they were formulated, but of course they're still very, very basic, and they're, and one of the excitement about presenting it here today is that I am hoping to get feedback from all of you. So these are preliminary, but therefore in written format, and I will read from the text. I know it's not common to do that, but I hope that it'll be easier then for you to engage with the argument without any distracting slides. So in every period of history, we've had hierarchies between knowledge systems and resulting contestations between them. In pre-modern history, we find the contestations between different knowledge systems that emerged from different contexts, whether they were ecological contexts, economic and social, and superiority was claimed on these grounds to create hierarchies. So while these caused conflicts, we also find a great deal of collaboration and accommodation between knowledge systems, documented in efforts at translation of texts across kingdoms in the pre-modern world. And as E.L. Basham, a great historian of that time, has said, the dialogue of medicines, when he was talking about medical knowledge systems actually, that the dialogue of medicines recognized incommensurability, but allowed for translation. I think that there's a lot that's been said about work of collaboration of that time, something that we need to remember. In the modern period, the character of the hierarchies changed dramatically. The emergence of the scientific method and the knowledge produced by it sought to establish its dominance by declaring that it was universal, irrespective of the contexts that knowledges were bound by earlier. It also declared that all knowledges prior to it were now obsolete, setting up a notion of a different temporality of knowledge, one that always went forward in time. This is by now, of course, well known, and a great deal of discussion has taken place on it. In this afternoon's lecture, I will present my understanding of this debate, and as the title suggests, what I see as the pathway for the future, with a special reference to knowledges in health and medicine. In the first part of my lecture, I will discuss the contestations between knowledges, with a focus on that between Ayurveda and biomedicine. As Abha pointed out in our introduction, this is the area of knowledge that I've worked in for most of my career, and I know better than I know other knowledges. So which is why I will rely on that field. But I will also make references to others. In the second part of my lecture, I will link this to two global debates on decoloniality and on the epistemologies of the global South. These debates show how the hierarchies between knowledge systems is a phenomenon that is endemic in all countries that have faced colonialism. And it also demonstrates that it is part of a deeply unequal economic and political power structure. The resulting epistemic and cognitive injustice is a denial of knowledges that built significant civilizations that lasted over millennia without destroying the planet. I think this is something that we need to emphasize. I would like to emphasize. So this discussion on decoloniality and epistemologies of the global South then will bring me to the third part of my lecture, which is locating this discussion in the context of the climate crisis. The insistence on the absolute superiority of modern knowledge and a denial of other knowledges has together resulted in a loss of alternative frames of theory and practice that could contain the excesses of modern knowledge, apart from, of course, the loss of cultural confidence of the people of the global South. Finally, I will discuss a way out of the debate between strict binaries, between knowledges, and the way forward, so a way out of this debate and a way forward. So, to start with the first part, in the context of contestations between colonizers and colonized people, the contestations between knowledges became very sharp, with the knowledge systems held by the latter being declared obsolete. That is, knowledge systems held by colonized people being declared obsolete. In fact, Ashish Nandy, who some of you, or all of you may be aware, is a political psychologist, social theorist, and critic, argued ever so long ago that this was one of the primary instruments of subjugation, not just coercive power, that is, instruments of subjugation by the colonizer. And this subjugation led to the creation of what he calls the intimate enemy of the colonized. And this enemy remained long after the dismantling of the institutions of colonialism and the transfer of power. The notion of tradition and traditional knowledge developed as a counter to modern knowledge to establish that there was credence to the former. So the idea of a traditional knowledge is a product of modernity. Through the period of colonialism and after, what followed was the fraught contestation between traditional and modern knowledges, each capturing the conceptual space of epistemology and of the practical space of application, such that the twain could meet only under circumstances peculiarly produced by the hegemonic parameters of science with a capital S. This is the argument I made in my book, Power Knowledge of Medicine, Ayurvedic Pharmaceuticals at Home and in the World, that was published in 2009. But that was a very long time ago. So let me give you a quick summary of what I was saying in that book. One aspect of the transformation of Ayurveda from the end of the 19th century till date has been the process by which it has cast itself in the image of biomedicine, in production and positioning in the market, which meant the products were both in classical medicine forms and those of the patent and proprietary medicines. It resulted in the basic transformation of the traditional product in the market of industrial capitalism. That's why I called it the Ayurvedic pharmaceutical. This is one part of Ayurveda. This is not all of Ayurveda. Ayurveda is a very, very large domain of knowledge with lots of different kinds of practices. This is one aspect. One of the people who reviewed my book pointed this out that I need to mention, and I always remember to flag this. So the transformation of the classical medicines in this domain of production was that they were produced in large quantities and increasingly changed both packaging and actual forms, as in the change of asavas and arishtas to PET bottles and then to tablet form. That's just an example of what I mean. Both necessitated creating fresh norms of standardization that were the hallmark of mass production under industrial production. The patent and proprietary medicines were a fresh initiative, which necessitated clinical and a host of other trials in order for them to be launched as new medication in the market. This, of course, we all know. By these processes, I have argued earlier, this part of Ayurveda shifted from being the other of biomedicine, the other knowledge, into that of its double, by which I mean it sought to emulate the characteristics of modern pharmaceuticals in the new frameworks of production, presentation, and pricing in order that they become more accessible, and thereby offered them, that is, these new Ayurvedic pharmaceuticals, as competition in the modern market. Another important outcome of mass production is also meant to make medicines more affordable. But we know that that is not necessarily the case with Ayurvedic medicines. There's no scope here to discuss this whole question, but if there are questions, I'm happy to take them. A number of issues remain with these drugs, and I've engaged with some of them even after the book. And today, I will focus on the more fundamental debates on the levels of epistemology and the evidence base of knowledge systems. Very, very important debate and a very important parameter of our times. Modern Ayurvedic research has actually taken these issues very seriously in at least two respects. And we can say, for the sake of discussion now, that these two aspects are at two ends of the spectrum of research on Ayurveda, with a great many variants in between. So of the two ends, one has been to establish the validity of its medicines, of Ayurvedic medicines, plant-based, etc., by applying modern scientific criteria of validation to do so. Even when it has been difficult, even impossible to do so for compound drugs, which means, compound drugs mean that there are not only multiple plant inputs, but also complex combinations of making them in a drug, there have been attempts to establish the veracity through applying different kinds of pharmacological tests that were basically designed for pharmaceuticals for biomedicine. This has generated one kind of evidence base. And I must point out that within the Ayurvedic community, there is a great deal of debate and discussion about the value, about the quality of this research, and the fact that there is so much debate, the fact that there is so much, sometimes great discomfort, does imply a very significant level of engagement with the requirement for evidence base, which I think needs to be part of the larger discussion on knowledge systems. Another strand of research, which I say, it could be the other end of the spectrum, has engaged at a more fundamental level with biomedicine, seeking translation across epistemological parameters, which have indicated both similarities as well as differences with biomedicine. Naturally, these are two very, very different systems of medicine with different philosophical parameters. And yet, when there have been translations attempted across them, naturally, some things have emerged to be similar. And what is important, to go back to what Basham said, which is that there's incommensurability in terms of many different aspects of the epistemologies, but there is an attempt at translation. And I think that that's a very important attitude in the development of any knowledge system. So what is significant is that it has resulted in collaboration, nevertheless, and joint publication in prestigious journals. I'm sure there are some of you here who must be familiar with this. And again, if there are questions, I'll take them happily. and tell you what I know. I have discussed these in detail in actually published articles. So if you're interested, I can refer them to you. Here I'm simply flagging them. Further, I think, and this is the important part of Ayurveda's engagement and involvement with biomedicine, and in fact, biomedicine's whatever extent of engagement it has had with them, that Ayurveda has had an interesting effect on some parts of the practice and even theory of biomedicine. The best examples of preferring competition, if you have to just see what the intent of Ayurvedic manufacturers at the beginning of the 20th century, that example of preferring competition has been made by, of course, the Himalaya Drug Company, that filled an obvious gap in the pharmaceutical market with its best-selling formulation, Live 52. So I'm talking about the Himalaya Drug Company, which we all know about. The newer practice regimes, like those of functional medicine, very, very contemporary practice regime, have acknowledged the importance of the active principles of medicinal plants and incorporating them into treatment regimes apart from other medical knowledge systems. So these are just instances. There are very many more, and there are a great number of scientists who engage with the knowledge of medicinal plants that can be had from local healers, from local communities, etc. So there's a huge body of research. I'm just flagging a few things here just to indicate what is it that I'm talking about. So there are similar stories. Now, from what we see in the medical knowledge systems, there are similar stories in many other knowledge systems in India as well. I can name at least 10, including medicine. Those for cloth making, agriculture, pottery, iron, leather, architecture, water management, forestry and common resource management, pastoralism, nomadic communities, and their knowledges. So for each of these, there are similar trajectories of contestations and collaborations, the former outnumbering the latter, of course. But the important thing is that there is continuous engagement, and there's continuous, contestation is a very, very important indicator of a healthy cohabitation of different systems. And I think that it then allows for engagement, it allows for thinking through different kinds of possibilities, which is basically what I am arguing for. So if there's interest in any of these, I'm happy to share again what I know about their trajectories. I'm fortunate, one of the fun things about being in the university, and I know that there are not that many, the fun thing of being in a university is that one gets to have research students who come to you because they are interested in the ideas that you're trying to explore. And I've been fortunate. I have a group of students, doctoral students, who pick different kinds of knowledge systems to engage with the analytical framework that I have developed over time. And we are actually now collectively exploring many of the trajectories of these knowledge systems that I was talking about. And I hope that in the next few months, we shall all be also collaborating and co-creating the argument of how they are understood in modernity. This is a very important analytical frame, and I'm excited that we are a group of people who are thinking about this. Now, this example that I offered to you in terms of the hierarchies between knowledge systems and what kinds of outcomes emerge from the contestations that these hierarchies generate. This then I would like to link, as I said in the second part of my lecture, to two global debates. And I bring them particularly here because I know that those who work with health and medicine actually are identifying many of these thoughts, many of these ideas, many of these lines of argument. But often those that are actually articulating them theoretically in philosophical terms or in social science terms operate in different domains, and the two domains hardly ever meet. And I think that's another thing that we need to address. But I thought that here I would like to bring those ideas for us to think collectively on how they can be taken forward. So the two important global debates which I'm referring to, there are others, but these I think are particularly important. One is the literature on decoloniality, and the other is the literature on the epistemologies of the global South, very closely linked, but there's a little bit of distinctiveness in each of them, and I'd like to just share that with you. So the literature of decoloniality and its significance for the contemporary turn, in knowledge systems is very important. It challenges the constructed hierarchy between knowledge systems, particularly through the colonizing process, and explains how it is carried over into the post-colonial and how this builds up to what they call post-coloniality without the hyphen. Ndlovu Gatsheni, a South African thinker, writes, and I quote, it's a slightly long quote, "The problem of the 21st century in the knowledge domain is best rendered as the epistemic line," he calls it. It cascades directly from William Du Bois' color line. Du Bois actually talked about the color line of the 20th century, which haunted the 20th century and provoked epic struggles for political decolonization. The connection between the color line and the epistemic line is in the racist denial of the humanity of those who became targets of enslavement and colonization. The denial of humanity automatically disqualified one from epistemic virtue. Close quotes. So if this is recognized and addressed politically, that is the epistemic line, then it will engender what Ndlovu Gatsheni calls epistemic freedom. And to explain what he means by epistemic freedom, I quote him again, that is, democratizing knowledge from its current rendition in the singular into its plural, known as knowledges. It is also ranged against overrepresentation of Eurocentric thought in knowledge, social theory, and education. Epistemic freedom is foundational in the broader decolonization struggle because it enables the emergence of critical decolonial consciousness. Close quotes. So in this sense, it is foundational for even economic and political sovereignty, which is sought from the process of political decolonization onwards since the middle of the 20th century. So political and economic decolonization would be substantially achieved, actually, when, excuse me, this epistemic freedom becomes a norm. Epistemic freedom becomes the foundation of a particular kind of democratization of knowledge. In fact, this idea, Ndlovu Gatsheni develops systematically now, but it was addressed much earlier in Africa by the famous writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's actually a contemporary of Ashish Nandy. He too is writing in the mid-80s when I was a student. And he argued, and I quote, "The problem of coloniality of knowledge, which took the form of invasion of the mental universe of the colonized world, is what epistemic enslavement is about, and what Ashish Nandy calls colonization of the mind." So it's very interesting that across the global South, these very powerful, reflexive thinkers are offering these insights 30, 40 years after the process of decolonization took place. And this is what makes us, should make us think about how we think about knowledge, the production of knowledge and the creation of knowledge, and the frames of knowledge that exist in different parts of the world. So complementary to this literature on decoloniality, and there's a lot more on decoloniality, I just picked Ndlovu Gatsheni because it's a very, very powerful voice from Africa. But complementary to this literature is that on the epistemologies of the South. that is possibly more grounded in the experiential spaces of knowledge practice and how epistemological asymmetries lead to cognitive injustice there. Boaventura de Sousa Santos, credited for powerfully arguing for a place for these epistemologies, also argues for, and I quote, third way epistemologies that have revealed that scientific research depends on a complex mix of science and non-science constructs. The selection of topics, problems, theoretical models, methodologies, languages, images, and forms of argument. Through historical and ethnographic research, those that argue for third way epistemologies have, or rather those who have studied scientific research in terms of context, have studied the material cultures of the sciences. That is, the different ways in which scientists relate to institutional contexts, to their peers, to the state, to funding agencies and entities, and to economic interests or to public interests. They have highlighted, I'm sure there must be a lot of resonance in a lot of the minds who are listening here. They have, through their analyses of the heterogeneity of practices and of scientific narratives, these approaches have exploded the presumed epistemological and praxeological unity of science and turned the opposition of the two cultures, the sciences and the humanities, as a structuring feature of the field of knowledge into a rather unstable plurality of scientific and epistemic cultures and configurations of knowledges. And I close quotes here. So Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who's talked about epistemologies of the South and has been one of the most important and powerful votaries for arguing that there is a great deal of knowledge in the South which needs to be accepted and to be given credence and to be given a place in contemporary development. He also offers this very, very important understanding, which he collates, puts together from so many social constructions of science studies, and argues for third way epistemologies. I think that this is particularly significant for the kind of way forward that we need to identify most certainly. And then we find some a sociologist of science in India, like Shiv Vishwanathan, who coined the term cognitive justice to argue for a different outcome to the struggles of the 21st century. He argues, and I quote from Vishwanathan, cognitive justice recognizes the right of different forms of knowledge to coexist, but adds that this plurality needs to go beyond tolerance or liberalism to an active recognition of the need for diversity. It demands recognition of knowledges, not only as methods, but as ways of life. This presupposes that knowledge is embedded in ecology of knowledges, where each knowledge has its place, its claims to a cosmology, its sense as a form of life. Close quote. So for this then, Vishwanathan argues that we need diversity, but that's our starting point. We need to go beyond diversity as well, because he says, if diversity is a recognition of difference, then plurality is an engagement across differences. And this is a very, very powerful idea that has actually found voice in the practice of people. And I will return to this idea in the last part of the section, in the last section of my lecture. So the bottom line of the knowledge debate that is being increasingly acknowledged is that the claim of superiority of scientific knowledge and technology is now compromised by the climate crisis. Now, this is another aspect of the whole knowledge debate. With the depleting ozone layer, the rise of temperatures, carbon emissions, and so on, all of these, which can be traced to fossil fuel guzzling technologies, it is clear that some aspects of modern science and technology are seriously flawed. Urgent measures delineated as mitigation, adaptation, and resilience are required. This, of course, is something that is spelled out in all kinds of international reports, etc., but most importantly by the IPCC report that all of us are familiar with. And yet, when it is clearly recognized that urgent measures are required, the solutions that are offered by green capitalism, which largely tinker at the edges of capitalist technology, those are simply not enough. And this is a huge debate in terms of what kinds of solutions are being offered, what kind of, benefits they have for the short term, for the long term, but more importantly, which kinds of technologies benefit which kinds of people. That's very, very important. And again and again and again, it comes to the understanding that these technologies, or these kinds of solutions that are being offered within that frame of technology are fairly limited. What is required, in fact, is a significant complementary input of altering the frames of production systems themselves, beginning with their epistemological base, actually, wherever and to whatever extent possible. And in this, a very important aspect that we need to remember is that while capitalism is very powerful, capitalist technologies are dominant, they're all across the world, much of the global south and peoples of the global south actually do not directly benefit from these technologies, or they all benefit very, very marginally from these technologies. And all studies on what is happening to the climate show that the negative impacts of the climate crisis and what is the climate crisis is actually faced by people of the global south. This is a common knowledge by now. I'm just bringing it into the knowledge argument to then say that, if we know this, then we have to understand that there needs to be an engagement of a completely different kind, looking at responses to the climate crisis in completely different ways. And for that, I am arguing it's important to look at all of these knowledges and knowledge systems that exist across the global south and which people have continued to use despite being marginalized by capitalism. This is the debate that really we need to now consolidate, and the voices are there all across. But the given current academic state of the debate on knowledge, that continues to be built on binaries of epistemologies and tending towards the impossible mediation between them. A recent paper authored by three very good scholars, Ellen Harzelius-Klug, Vivek Oak, and Annapurna Mamadapudi, have argued, and I quote, "The natural outcome of policies to foster technological innovation is the myth of creative destruction and technological determinism, that there can be no coexistence of the old and the new in the narrative of progressive technology." And close quotes. And yet, if we are to look at the kinds of innovations on the ground by ordinary people, whether in the careful documentation by Anil Gupta or Pankaj Sekhsaria's demystifying the understanding of jugaad, what we call jugaad, we find common perceptions and attitudes. Despite these two scholars being from different generations and approaches to innovation studies, both show that there is a basic position of genuine engagement between different and almost alien knowledge systems and techniques, focusing on what could be useful from them that enable adapting and adopting them. This is evident, of course, and there's so many examples any conversation with Anil Gupta always enriches one by more instances of how people adapt, and adaptation of machinery by farmers, the understanding of biomechanics, ordinary illiterate mechanics of newer models of cars, the classification of disease conditions by patients in terms of which knowledge system is best suited for them. In my book, I talked about a 4-way classification, and I find that many people have also talked about that, about chronic illnesses and so on and so forth. So these are very much in evidence. This is from the point of view of so-called users of technology, but even in even amongst the practitioners, the knowledge carriers, in the hierarchy of knowledges, I think that doctors in India and possibly across the global south, and that's anecdotal evidence that I have found in other parts of the global south. I haven't really done any studies or looked at any studies, but doctors in India certainly set collaborations amongst themselves between different knowledge systems on patients requiring different kinds of treatment according to whichever kind of disease condition and the stage in which it is that they suffer from at any point in time. So I'm sure all of us are aware of doctors across biomedicine and, of course, we call it allopathy, homeopathy, allopathy, Ayurveda, homeopathy, Unani, Ayurveda, all kinds of collaborations which are informal because they're not documented and not published for veracity, but certainly practiced by people across their careers, which they do in the best interest of the patient and which they believe, and many of which are of great value to patients. And not all of them they are extremely responsible people who take this step with great awareness of what they're doing. So, which is not to say that it's fine. What I'm saying is that collaboration, adaptation, acknowledgement of the value of the other, these exist. And it is the job of the academic to interpret, to understand the value of this collaboration and to see what is changing in the creation and adaptation and production of knowledge. And I think this is something that we are not really tuned to. I think it's high time, because this is a very valuable space that people have created for themselves outside of institutions that do research, outside of companies that manufacture products. These are spaces in which people have actually co-created knowledges. And I think that we need to understand and problematize this. So I think that when we're talking about knowledges, we don't need to look back. When people say, oh, so are you suggesting, Madhulika, that we should look back to knowledges and, we have to go back in time? That doesn't make sense. You cannot go back in time. But I'm not even suggesting that to look back. I think, let alone go back, but actually look at the margins to which we have pushed so much knowledge and practice because we believed them to be irrelevant. We need to rediscover that margin in terms of the possibility it offers for the contemporary, of how it has survived and thrived despite being pushed there, and what those mechanisms of survival and thriving are. I think this is the exercise that we need to undertake, and that would actually provide very useful insights to the contemporary. So finally, and this brings me to my last section, it leads me to think that we need a much more nuanced and inclusive understanding of knowledge now. One that follows, as I was saying, like a lot of theorization, somewhat belatedly, the practice. And I think that those in academia particularly need to recognize that we are almost always behind the practice which surrounds us, actually, because possibly we derive a lot of the frames of analysis that we deploy from not that which is around us, but possibly developed in contexts that have no relevance or not no resemblance to the context in which we live and the context that we need to interpret. I argue that we need to move beyond wrestling with the idea of a universal and contextual knowledge, this binary. And we move on to the idea of a pluriversal knowledge. We need to build an understanding about knowledges that have both comfortable and uncomfortable mediation between epistemologies and techniques that enable the managing of the everyday lives of people. We need to recognize that it is in the interest of human populations that we adopt a much more open and adaptive approach to knowledge, because that is evidently the more grounded and tested form. We need to explore the ground for more communication and exchange between different knowledge systems without one seeking to hegemonize the other or dominate the other. In this effort, then, for instance, we would need to acknowledge that the relationship between human beings and nature by epistemologies of the global south were what prolonged the reserve of the earth's resources for human beings. This needs to be recognized. These epistemologies built up from the former's position, being part of the same universe as all nature, and therefore not in a position to take control of it. So this is not a very well-worded sentence. What I'm trying to say is that the epistemologies of the global south began with the understanding that all human beings are part and parcel of the universe. They are the same universe and different aspects of nature in that universe, which they need to use in order to survive. But because they are a part of the same, therefore, they cannot take control of it. They have to use it, but they have to use it with a certain sense of humility. And also that when you know that you're part of what you're using, then you will be judicious about the way in which you use it. And it is from here that so many different kinds of knowledges, which Ashish Kothari and the others who published that lovely 25th anniversary dictionary of development, they called it Pluriverse. They argue of all the different kinds of concepts in the global south, Buen Vivir, and what's the other one that the African word, I can't remember suddenly. So these have all, Ubuntu, yes, of course, Ubuntu came up, in which your interest is actually there is no clash between the individual and the interest of the community, because the individual is because the community is, and the community exists because of the individual. So a kind of interconnection is what defines interests, and not necessarily a resolution of conflict. This is a foundational difference. And from that, production systems of consumption, systems of distribution that are built would have a very, very different kind of character. On this too, there's a lot of thinking and literature and writing. And this is what we need to bring together. And we need to remember that these epistemologies helped human beings to be responsible for themselves, as well as for the generations that came after them. So this is the problem that is striking us now. And so this is what we need to address, and therefore need to get out of this idea of this universal knowledge that is going to solve all problems, but to look at a variety, diversity, and plurality of knowledges, which actually have the capacity for us to actually save the present for the future. So finally, then, I think, when I was writing the presentation and I looked at the title again, I thought to myself, it needs to be changed. It now should read, really, Pluriversal Knowledges as Pathways for the Future. Pluriversal Knowledges as Pathways for the Future. Some explorations. You think, is it different? Yeah. The definitive article, the, needs to be removed. If we are looking at plurality, then the erasure of that definitive article is necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Banerjee, for this excellent and a very provocative presentation. So there are a few questions in the chat box, but I think we'll wait for some time for people to process and think and give some questions if they have. So in the meantime, I'll ask a couple of questions to take the discussion forward. So I personally would largely agree with a lot of ideas that you have shared, but to make it interesting, I'll obviously not take your side and ask more questions to challenge the ideas that are presented. So first of all, is it really a question of the problem in the sociology and politics of science, or in the science itself? You raised multiple times that it is the epistemologies that are a concern, including at the level of climate change as a product of some aspects of science and technology. That's how you actually phrased it. But the way in which modernity or modern social systems have conceptualized our living with respect to, say, consumerism or a more luxury-oriented lifestyle can easily be considered as the culprits for what's going on. But why are you focusing on the knowledge per se? In fact, even in the case of climate change, it is actually the science that is telling us that there are issues with how we are dealing with the modern, with our reality. So science shouldn't really be seen as the problem created.
This is, of course, the all-important and very difficult question, but it's important to confront. I think that the epistemology of science is problematic in as much that it focuses on explanation of aspects of reality as the explanation that precludes others. This is the problem. If we were to look at it in a very, very basic level. Now, when you say that climate science itself is telling us what the problem is, that actually links to what the reference I made to the social construction of science studies that Boaventura de Sousa Santos talks about, which is that there is so much plurality even within the world of science. So where is the claim for that kind of definitive singular definitive singular kind of explanation for things which are valuable, but which cannot be exclusive, which cannot have the position of being exclusive explanations? I think this is where we need to understand that the definitive article needs to go from a large number of constructions of science. That is very, it's important. And the thing is that, you can't really extricate that from the outcomes or the problems created by the sociology and politics of science, as you called it. So yes, of course, consumerism is. So no scientist would say that the fact that you can use diesel to run big trucks implies that you must have, or that you've created intense refrigeration systems, means that you must eat food that is grown and harvested in one place, and then refrigerate. What is the word I'm looking for?
Processed at the other place, probably.
Sorry?
Food processing happening at another place.
And processed in such a way, and then carried across thousands of kilometers to be so that's not the dictum that science is putting out, but that is one part of the problem. But I think in the way in which knowledge creation, so we need to separate these things and yet understand how each of them complement each other. That is the process. And in this, it's very important. We've come through, in my own lifetime, I have seen a whole shift in the debate. But however much people may contribute to the richness of the debate, and so on. We keep returning to this whole binary of science and non-science, which is so unproductive. And therefore, it is important to point out that there are some aspects of scientific explanation that are problematic. Doesn't mean that when I say science, it means all of scientific explanation is irrelevant or unproductive. No, we need to have that. Yeah.
Thanks.
I can see that, sorry, did you have another question?
No.
Okay, I can see Dr. Abha's question. Shall I take that?
Yeah, please.
That's a very, very important question. Dominance of knowledge systems and the social hierarchies. I mean, it's an equally important aspect as far as I'm concerned. As a social scientist, of course, for me, and as a deeply political person, that's very important, because there are hierarchies between knowledge systems and there are hierarchies within knowledge systems, which are very powerful and which have powerful implications for the kind of knowledge that is also generated. And here I would talk more also about the epistemologies and knowledge systems of the South. We have enough critique going on science and so on, and sometimes not enough, but I think plenty is written. But those who talk about the significance of the epistemologies of the global South are, I think, not conscious enough to flag constantly the deep inequalities within the knowledge systems of the global South, and the ways, and both the knowledge that is created, the people who create the knowledge. For instance, in India, of course, the deeply gendered knowledge of these practices, caste differences of knowledge practices. They are so, and the hierarchies that are prevalent within these knowledge practices are so intense and so deeply divisive. So those of us who talk about the hierarchies between epistemologies of the global South and the North need to be equally and sharply aware and sort of cognizant of the hierarchies within the social hierarchies within these knowledge systems. And a very important part of my discussion, actually, when I'm writing the book, is about these social hierarchies. Today, I wanted to talk about the pluriverse and the pluriversal pathways. So I did not refer to them, but this is a very important aspect. Thank you for raising it and giving me a chance to talk about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee. So, I mean, I was wondering if, connecting the two ideas that you just talked about, would the scientific temper that the constitutional, principle talks about in terms of the fundamental duties, I believe, of the citizens, is possibly trying to bring these two ideas together, if I understood you correctly, in the sense that there are aspects of science that do help us in promoting, one aspect of progress. And there are, blindly following the tradition per se may also be problematic, given the kind of social hierarchies and the way in which that could lead actually an increase in injustices. So a thought out application of both a traditional understanding and a scientific temper, which does not hegemonize one system over the other, is possibly what you are trying to argue at, if I understood that correctly, right?
Absolutely. It might be important to recognize that when scientific temper was introduced in the Constitution, I think in all likelihood, they had simply an understanding of modern scientific temper. And there's enough, sort of writing on this to, provide, that basis. So, and in the work of many social movements too, bringing in this, so it was like bringing scientific temper to a country and society that was living in the depths of some kind of mystery and mythology and not able to. So I'm afraid that was the original intent. That's how it has come down to us. But when absolutely, and specifically in today's context, I think it's very important to understand that what I am arguing is that we need to problematize all knowledges that we are working with in our society. If we are problematizing science, we don't problematize science at all. I think that's very important. But equally, when we are talking about non-modern knowledges, pluriversal knowledges, I like to call them now pluriversal knowledges, traditional knowledge is problematic because, when we say traditional knowledge, we are talking about a cultural category. We need to remember that traditional knowledge was constructed to counter modern knowledge that was imposed by the colonizer. So we don't need to work with this phrase anymore. What we are talking about is knowledges other than modern knowledge. And we need to, and let's remember that we now for the last 100 years or so have been participant in creating the modern knowledge as well. So it's not as if Indians do one or the other. They do both. But a critical and a very rigorously critical engagement with non-modern knowledges is very important. Critical questioning, understanding non-modern knowledges is very important. And for that, the most important thing is, then that's the beauty of our knowledge systems. They don't exist only in texts. The difficulty with a lot of contemporary discussion about traditional knowledge and harking back, the problem is, first of all, always harking back to 3,000 years ago. I mean, you are living in the present. When you hark back to 3,000 years ago, okay, so you know that we had this. So what? We had this 3,000 years ago, and often that reference is to texts. The beauty of much of that knowledge is that they haven't remained only within the textual domain, and they haven't remained, and they have not vanished 3,000 years ago. They have remained. They are part and parcel of the fabric of this society. People have been systematically engaging with them. And what is that systematic engagement? It is a continuous appraisal of both theory and practice. You just see medical knowledge, for instance. Medical knowledge, everyone talks about as if, of course, Ayurveda was the only knowledge system. There were so many others. And then, of course, in Ayurveda, there's the Brihatree. Okay, so the three major texts, Sushruta Samhita, Charaka Samhita, and the Ashtanga are there. Fine. But that is not what people are using when they practice. Hundreds and hundreds of commentaries, which are called Nikantus in North India, have been written over the years. And what is the defining principle of those texts and the commentaries? The texts have an overarching epistemological frame of medicine. The commentaries are adapting that knowledge to contexts. And it's very simple and yet profound that medical knowledge, where these knowledges believe that medical knowledge is context-driven. So if you have been brought up in South India, in a particular place in South India, that climate, that vegetation, that has actually informed the constitution of your body. So that informs your food intake, as well as if you're sick, the medicine intake. Obviously, the medicine that you will be given if you're sick cannot be the same as a medicine that would be given to somebody who's sick in Himachal or in Rajasthan, given that they are completely different ecologies, right? So in that sense, they are embedded knowledges in terms of the natural ecology. And so for those who claim that our knowledge, everything was acquired 3,000 years ago, is just factually incorrect. Because this has been a growing knowledge, it's a dynamic knowledge. And that is why it has survived such a long time. If it was to be fructified in text 3,000 years ago, it would not have survived. And that is what is so interesting about it. And that is what also shows up the diversity and what I call the plurality, because there's constant engagement between diverse knowledge systems to create new knowledges. So if Sheila Jasanoff is talking today about co-creation as a very important means of creating new knowledges, I mean, many epistemologies of the global South are about systematic and very different kinds of co-creation. I think that's what makes them so fascinating and so contemporary. So when we engage with them. That is why it is possible also to engage with them very critically, because they already have a tradition of critical engagement within these traditions. That's what I'm trying to say. So when we talk about developing a scientific temper today, a truly scientific temper would be a critical and systematic engagement with all the knowledge systems that we have to have, and to have the confidence to create knowledge, which we would believe that by the end of our working lives would be challenged by the new generation, and new things will come up, and we should not necessarily be afraid of that. I think this is what I mean. I'm sorry, it's a very long answer to your question.
No, but that's a very interesting take, because I mean, as you said, the way in which the scientific temper possibly got integrated had modern science in mind in that context, but we probably now need to look at it as a way of how we, as you said, not just tolerate but actually engage with pluriversal knowledge systems. That would possibly be the interpretation of that scientific temper if we have to look at it more contemporarily. So thanks for that. There is another question here that is asking for more examples on the exchange between knowledge systems in today's context. And I have a supplementary question conceptually. If you can relate this to the idea of incommensurability yet translatability between knowledge systems. So thoughts on a few more examples of what exactly these exchanges would look like.
One of my most favorite examples is in building technology. In the last 30, 35 years or so, a lot of people have been experimenting with different kinds of building technologies. So from using mud to all kinds of natural, sort of materials, and to building different kinds of buildings for different purposes. Now, here you find that people who actually innovate, and this is, real systematic, genuine innovation, where they are committed to building as organically as possible, which is to say that they use as many of the local materials as possible, which is what makes sense. Number one, local materials. Number two, local knowledge about how the building would be most stable for a long period of time. So stable in many ways, that it actually is a stable structure that stands years of time, and also stands any kind of shock. So whether it's excessive rain or earthquakes or whatever. So given the topology of any particular area, people have been building more ecologically. But I've spoken to and this is of course, it's not systematic field work, but I have spoken to so many different kinds of innovators in different parts of the country, all building with mud. That's the basic component. Each one of them says that, for some aspects of the building, they need to use some machine-made products, which actually enable the traditional technology to become stronger. Now, so the foundations are ecological, foundations are local, the techniques are local, but some of the products that they may use, and they are not local. They are machine-made, and they are, which does not, which still raises many other kinds of questions. But what I'm trying to say is that when people innovate, they are very conscious of being committed to a certain so epistemology of that process, while not being hesitant to deploy products or even ideas from others. And I think that in building, for instance, that's something that people have been able to do. Now, when you give this building example, often people will say, oh, so you can build skyscrapers with mud. So we are not talking about skyscrapers. We are talking about people's homes. And, in cities where we claim skyscrapers, and we are so proud that as a human civilization we have built skyscrapers. We forget that the number of shacks and completely unhealthy, inesthetic housing far outnumbers the skyscrapers we have built. So we need to think that when we are talking about certain kinds of knowledges of building, what kind of knowledges are we privileging and why? So this is one example. There's other favorite examples are from handloom, from water management. I mean, across, I named many of them. In each one of them, you will find these kinds of innovations and sort of learning processes, which are fascinating. And I think more and more need to be studied and to be understood for our context.
Thank you. So there are a couple of more questions, and if any more questions are there, I would request people to put them in Q&A quickly, so that we can take them together and ask Professor Banerjee to respond to a theme. So there are a couple of questions here. One, I guess you mostly touched upon, where the question is, by making it global north versus south, are we homogenizing the entire north and the south, which as I understand you countered as not necessarily the case. I mean, we have to also be aware of the internal hierarchies that are there within the social inequalities. So what do we actually mean when we say, if I understand the second part of that question correctly, when we say north and south, given that there are already generally dialogic civilizations, so people are exchanging ideas, so there is nothing at an abstract level purely a global north idea versus a global south idea. So your thoughts on that?
The thing is, there's a lot of circulation, there's a lot of exchange, no question, dialogic civilization. I'm a great admirer of Arun Bala's work, actually. No question. And I think what is very important about Bala's argument is that he highlights the fact of how much contribution there must have been from the knowledges of the global south to the so-called dominant and European knowledge system. So I think that's important. But, I think it's equally important to recognize that the way in the institutional and other frames in which knowledges are talked about, and the lives of people in the global north, actually there is a great deal of isolation, demarcation, and the understanding of the global north about the global south and the distance it has. We should not underestimate it. It's very, very much a part of the way in which power structures are present even today, and which then influence the way in which all policies, all ideas are articulated in the global north, which have very far-reaching implications for the global south. Look at the IPCC report. If there was more dialogic, growth of knowledge as of now, on page 27 of the summary report, there is one mention of local or indigenous knowledges. One mention in the entire report. And this was pointed out to me by one of the authors, actually, who was a colleague in the institute where I was at Hamburg. And she said, Madhulika, I have been personally very excited by the idea of LKIK, as they call it, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge. For them, it's one label. She said, I'm so sorry that, I'm using such a blunt sort of tool, but that's how we refer to it. But, we understand very little of what these knowledges are, and the way you talk about them, it's as if it's a whole universe, which we have no idea about. So we should not be unaware. And in the last year that I was there, I spent a good deal of time, discussing with people, genuinely committed people, interested people who are clueless about what's going on in the global south, and that defines the majority. And this is what has serious implications for policy. So we should not be unaware of this. And dynamics of power that it generates.
Yeah,
Very,
sure.
yeah.
Thanks for clarifying. So essentially, so the idea of variations within Global South at one end, and also the transfer of epistemologies to a certain extent between the two, cannot still explain or justify the elephant in the rooms in a way. Significant difference between the South and the North that we currently are experiencing. So that boundary has to be understood, even when we are trying to discuss the internal conflicts or variations or dialogues for that matter.
Sure.
So there are, I think these two may have to be the last two questions. So one is about what is the meaning of theory and theory development in this kind of a pluriverse? And if I understand it correctly, is it trying to more or less problematize, because theorization is usually understood as an abstraction at the level of the universal truth in a way. So when we talk about pluriversality, are we undermining the need for any theorization? Or is there a meaning for theorization in this context?
We are thinking of a different kind of theorization. The problem is that we think of theorization as an abstraction to arrive at a universal truth. That is precisely what we are questioning. And the fact is that there is no need for a universal truth, while we recognize that there should be. I mean, we are not going at a complete extreme of relativization either. So we are very, also we need to be very conscious, even when making this argument, that there are certain fundamentals which we can call universals, which cannot be messed with. So which are about the dignity of human beings, rights that they have, gender equality, and recognizing that any practice of social inequality associated with knowledge practices is unacceptable. So these bottom lines are certainly a reference point. But then to recognize that we aspiring for universality traps us in trying to find one-size-fits-all solutions. And again, we come to the understanding that one size does not fit all. It's not necessary. So how do we reconcile these two things? So how do we say that, yes, we would like theorization that works for certain kinds of contexts, without it getting into a relativist position in which we also justify a lot of inequality and injustice that comes along with that relativization. So, so we are looking at a different kind of theorization. And the problem is that theorization is far cry. First, we have to recognize what is there on the ground in front of us, under our noses, actually. Then we will be able to. And my experience in the last 35 years of working with Ayurveda and medicine is that people are so afraid that, something that they have believed to be the truth is now going to be shaken up. But then, human kind has succeeded again and again by shaking up the truth. Why are we afraid? And wonderful things have resulted from that. So I think we should look forward to it.
Right. Thank you. So this is probably something similar to what we see broadly in, say, policy research, or more so in health policy and systems kinds of research, where people talk about this, mid-level theorization, where there are certain things that you can actually abstract as the universal, but there are many details and the context that have to be respected and developed in those ideas. So as you mentioned, the larger principles of human dignity, etc., can be of course, have to be the universal bottom line. So it's not a messing up of that, but the methodologies and the processes to actually reach there, and the way people understand the processes in developing a theory to attain them have to be respected, and the pluriversality there need to be preserved. So there's one last question that is talking about if there is really an exchange of knowledge between two systems in a way, then there is possibly some kind of a transgression of the boundaries of those knowledge systems. And would that be acceptable? And if relating back to the example that you mentioned of in a way, Ayurveda developing under the image of allopathy is possibly a transgressing Ayurvedic boundary at one point, or even the question that you mentioned, the example that you gave of, some of the allopathic practitioners being open to multiple systems coming with them. So what exactly is the nature of that exchange? Is it affecting the boundary that possibly need to be sacrosanct in some way to preserve that very knowledge system? Otherwise, the pluriversality itself can be questioned. So, yeah.
So in fact, both the examples that you cited interest me greatly, and I'd be happy to talk about that. When Ayurveda's, this whole struggle with validation has been an old one. And the problem that if you are expected to conduct, for instance, randomized clinical trials for Ayurvedic medicine, according to a biomedical practitioner, biomedical criteria, parameters, how does that work? That is a real problem of contradiction between epistemologies, because the whole process that defines the diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment of any disease condition are foundationally different in allopathy and in Ayurveda. Then how do you validate? If you want to say, no, I'll show you that it works, then what would be the parameters? And this is where the work of Ram Manohar, P. Ram Manohar, who's a wonderful Vaidya in Kerala, based in Kochi at the moment, Ram Manohar undertook something that, in fact, an early anthropologist of Ayurveda, who had studied Ayurveda, pioneering anthropologist who we all respected greatly and learned from, Charles Leslie. Leslie had said as far back in the mid-80s first, and then the early 90s also, that doing randomized clinical trials according to Ayurvedic parameters is not possible. And in the mid-2010s, Ram Manohar actually systematically created a clinical trial according to the parameters of Ayurveda. So the idea of a clinical trial is a new one, but the parameters are derived from the epistemology of Ayurveda. And he took it to the National Institutes of Health to study something with a very, very difficult condition called rheumatoid arthritis. And they had a study to examine one of their medicines, methotrexate. And Ram Manohar offered that they would do a comparative study of methotrexate and Ayurvedic treatment. So they said, fine, okay. So there was a lot of exchange, discussion, etc. And then they finally accepted the trial, that, okay, this sounds like a proper, rigorous trial, albeit by Ayurvedic parameters, in which what Ram Manohar did was to translate every single step of the it's a precarious thing. All translation is precarious, but he translated every step to explain to them what it would mean in their terms. So look at the authority this man has on both, knowledge systems. They accepted it, and then they said, okay, fine, we'll do a 6-week clinical trial, because that's what methotrexate requires. And Ram Manohar said, no, we can't do a trial in 6 weeks. Rheumatoid arthritis, according to Ayurvedic parameters, will require 6 months. So we will do a 6-month trial. Next, the NIH said, okay, so tell us how we set it all up and so on in the US. And Ram Manohar said, we have a full setup in India. I'm going to do it there because I have control. I know that everybody is trained to do this kind of thing. How am I going to carry so many people there? I would rather do it here. But we have all the wherewithal for doing RCTs of biomedical products. If you like, you can do your trial here as well. So he had the NIH bring their trial here. Look at the kind of boundaries we are going back and forth on, right? And so he conducted this. And then this is the study is published in the Journal of Rheumatoid Disorders, and establishes a kind of legitimacy on both sides. So there isn't a transgression, yet there's a translation. It's an excellent example of this possibility being there. As for collaboration by doctors and so on. I think that, because there aren't any studies. In fact, one of the things I will always regret is that I watched my father, who was a surgeon, collaborate with a homeopath for about 25 years. It didn't occur to me that we should have just documented that. And there must be so many doctors who do this and who need to document it. And that needs to be systematically studied as to what is it that they're doing. Where do they think they are actually overstepping the boundaries? Why do they do that? Does it compromise what they have learned, the knowledge system with which they're working, or does it enrich it? I'm afraid I have no empirical or rigorous evidence for this, but I'm sure none of us who are, in this discussion would deny that this happens all the time. And of course, now there are this is not at an informal level, but it is happening in big hospitals where cancer patients aftercare is happening with Ayurveda and so on and so forth, and some of our very well-known Ayurvedic physicians are collaborating on this kind of work. And I think that needs to be studied. What exactly are they doing so that we understand, this process better.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is so fascinating explanation for such complex ideas, and you have brought together, the science questions, the philosophy questions, and the politics and policy so nicely together to say that these should not be and need not be seen in silos, and there is actually a benefit of looking at the otherwise seen as theoretical philosophical discussion in this context of a real problem of inequality. And I also raised the bar of looking at inequalities not necessarily at of course, I mean, we are not discounting what how does it translate in reality, but also looking at the cognitive and the knowledge game that the inequality plays. So thank you very much, Professor Banerjee. We would love to have you in these conversations even in the future. And thank you once again. And I thank all the participants for very interesting questions and being engaged throughout this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much again for inviting me. And this was such a good discussion. Thank you for the questions to everyone who asked them. Thank you very much.